Super Sprint is not just a great racing game, it's one of the best games ever made. And you don't need to take my word for that, because when Next Generation Magazine decided to count down the top 100 games of all time, this Atari classic managed to come in at number 59. It was able to perfectly straddle the line between precision driving and just utter chaos, especially when you played with friends. Now, nearly 4 decades later, Atari is bringing the series back with NeoSprint, a loving tribute that brings the overhead racer into the 21st century. Now the question remains, can this game work without one of those oversized arcade-style steering wheels? Well, that's what we're about to find out when I review NeoSprint from Atari. If you went to a pizza parlor or bowling alley in the 1980s, then there's a 100% chance that you ran into Super Sprint. With its memorable 3-person cabinet and massive steering wheel that you just couldn't resist spinning as violently as possible. This Atari classic took everything that was great about the Sprint series in the 1970s and turned it into one of the most exciting racing games of the 1980s. They then followed that up a few months later with Championship Sprint, a sequel of sorts that looked exactly the same but offered a whole bunch of new tracks to race. For a brief moment in 1986, it looked like this was going to be the relaunch of a whole new generation of Sprint games. Unfortunately, that did not happen. It's been 38 years since Atari released a Sprint game, and in that time, a lot has changed. We've gone from Mode 7 to the rise of polygonal racers to games that somehow look even more realistic than real life. In a world filled with Forzas and Gran Turismos, I sometimes wonder if there's even a place for this type of overhead racing game that I grew up with. Could it be that this type of game is just too outdated to be fun? Well, if NeoSprint is any indication, then the answer to that question is a resounding no way. Nearly 40 years after leaving its mark in the arcade, Atari has unexpectedly revived the Sprint series for a modern audience. NeoSprint picks up right where Championship Sprint left off, giving a whole new generation of gamers a chance to experience the chaotic fun of getting into a multi-car pile-up while speeding around impossibly sharp turns. It may not have the giant steering wheel of the arcade cabinet, but this is a faithful sequel that takes what was great about the 1980s game and adds just enough modern comforts to make it feel like a brand new experience. In that sense, Atari was wise to not shake things up too much. We've seen far too many classic franchises lose what made them special when they were transformed into a so-called modern game. NeoSprint could have very easily turned into a fairly straightforward 3D racer like everything else on the market. Instead, Headless Chicken Games has honored the racer's roots by sticking to the original overhead look. They've improved the graphics, added weather effects, and even given us a couple of ways to follow the action. But fans of the old school entries will feel right at home with this update. More than anything else, NeoSprint feels like a game that was made for consoles. This is a game that is absolutely bursting with different play modes and goodies to unlock. The kind of thing that'll keep you glued to the screen long after the nostalgia has worn off. Between the campaign, an obstacle course, the Grand Prix mode, the time trials, and even a free play mode with almost unlimited content thanks to the robust level editor, this takes everything that worked in the arcades and uses the consoles to deepen that experience in almost every conceivable way. Now, as far as the gameplay is concerned, NeoSprint stays surprisingly close to the arcade game. We obviously don't have the big steering wheel to violently whip around, but the developers do a good job of translating the arcade feel into a modern control pad. Just about the only addition to the gameplay is a handbrake that allows racers to take tighter turns. I was honestly happy to see that they didn't add a turbo button or try to cram in a bunch of power-up items, instead opting for just a pure race. If you feel like you need an extra challenge, you can add obstacles to the course, like an oil slick or traffic cones. That's really about as over the top as the game gets. The sequel does a surprisingly good job of recreating just the utter chaos that came with playing Super Sprint with your friends in the arcade. The tutorial tells us early on that this is a racing game that is all about strategy, and it can often feel like that strategy involves creating a bunch of multi-car pileups. The computer-controlled cars aren't just driving in a simple line like most racers, they're playing offensively and aren't afraid to knock you right off your path. Most of the races were decided by me crashing the competition and then gaining a lead so massive that it was impossible for anybody to catch up. You can save the perfect driving for the time trial mode, because I've found a lot of freedom in just bashing my way through most of the events. On the downside, this can lead to a game that often teeters on being a little bit too easy. Except for a couple of modes that demand more precision, I found myself absolutely dominating the competition by simply being the biggest bully on the block. I sped through almost all of the campaign with very little pushback, which made me yearn for a slightly better competition. There are just too many times when the computer would get turned around or stuck on the track and then just stop racing altogether. It reminded me of when my buddies would realize they're just so far behind that they gave up. Only I gotta say that it's not as satisfying when the computer does it. Look, that's a minor problem, and one that's mitigated by bumping up the difficulty and adding more racers to the course. The game has a lot of challenge modes that'll actively punish you for driving like an out-of-control madman, so what works in the campaign may not be the best strategy when tackling the obstacle course. And let me tell you, you're gonna need that Zen-like precision if you intend to unlock all the bonus items and cars that the game has to offer. Now, for the most part, the items that you unlock are connected to the track editor mode. Honestly, this is one of the best additions to the Sprint series, giving fans a chance to create and share their own stages, ultimately giving the game an almost unlimited amount of content. While I'm not the kind of person that tends to use these track editors, I like seeing the crazy monstrosities the community is able to come up with. From my experience, the editor was easy to use and deep enough to create some truly memorable tracks. Much like its arcade counterpart, NeoSprint is designed with multiplayer in mind. You and your friends will have a great time trying out all the new user-created content. There's just something about smashing your buddy's car that never gets old. Unfortunately, all of this is reserved for local play only. This is a real missed opportunity, especially given how spotty the computer can be at times. With so many tracks to play, I was hoping for online multiplayer modes. Or even online leaderboards for the different tracks. Sadly, you're going to have to invite your friends over to experience the competitive multiplayer fun. That's disappointing. What isn't disappointing are the visuals. NeoSprint has a nice clean design that updates the look of the 1980s game without being too flashy. I also really like that you can either have a fixed camera angle or have it be a bit closer to the track and follow the car. And did I mention that the game is filled with Atari references? Between the different characters, the cups, and the cars that you unlock, there are just so many Atari references, which is perfect for this style of racer. Of course, that might annoy some people, but honestly, I found the whole presentation to be incredibly charming. This is just a good example of a developer understanding what makes the old school game so much fun and expanding on it in smart ways. By keeping the gameplay relatively simple, it allowed the spotlight to shine on the tracks and multiplayer chaos that comes with those hairpin turns. Throw in a track editor and all kinds of extra goodies to unlock, and you have a game that fans will be playing for a long time to come. Let's just hope we don't have to wait another 38 years before the next installment. NeoSprint is yet another fun update from Atari. For decades after leaving its mark on pizza parlors and bowling alleys, the Sprint series is back, and you might be a little bit surprised by how faithful it is to the arcade classic. Although it's a bit on the easy side and sorely missing online multiplayer, this is a game jam-packed with modes, tracks, and unlockables. And just when you think you've seen it all, you'll discover an almost unlimited amount of user-created stages just waiting to be raced. NeoSprint is a loving sequel that perfectly captures the spirit of Super Sprint. Hey, thanks for watching my review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite overhead racing game? I didn't get into it in my review, but Super Sprint certainly inspired a lot of other racing games, including stuff that's come out within the last year or two. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, the weekend is finally here, but don't worry, I'm already working on next week's reviews. Guys, I'm slowly catching up, so expect to see big things in June. Make sure you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,